So hello there and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, the show where we talk all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula 1, and we relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending of course on which platform you choose to follow us on. And guys, sorry about the delay in the review. We weren't able to do a review as normal to be out on a Monday morning, but we are back. We are ready to give the Australian Grand Prix its overdue review, I should say. And the headline story is Charles Leclerc cementing what seemed to be a very, very strong looking early stage to his championship campaign by getting his second win of the season, arguably probably the most dominant victory of his Formula 1 career to date at the Australian Grand Prix. And in F1's homecoming, there's plenty of stories to talk about with the F1 homecoming in Australia. And of course, as well as Charles Leclerc and Ferrari's dominant display, there were also some miserable moments in the paddock for the Red Bull team where Max Verstappen's championship defence went from difficult to increasingly difficult after another DNF, already the second in 3 races, which leaves a lot to wonder how far Red Bull are going to have to climb in order to try and get back to where they feel they need to be, not just on performance but reliability as well. Dissecting the rest of this race review with me is my co-host for this episode, Lee Wallington. Lee, first of all, how are you doing? And did you have a good weekend?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Adam. Yeah, I had a great weekend. Obviously, I should add that I wasn't one of the people that got up early to watch the race, although in previous years I would have done, and just other plans stopped me from doing that this weekend. But watching it back, the full race and the full qualifying afterwards, such another enjoyable weekend. And yeah, these rules are really showing that they work.
Yeah, very much so. And, you're not the only one, Lee. Obviously, the reason why this review is out a little later than normal is because I wasn't at home in time to record the review on Sunday night. So definitely my fault on that one. And also, I was away this weekend, hence why we didn't have a live stream of qualifying, unfortunately. So I do apologise for that one, guys. That was a logistics error on my part in terms of planning my schedule around the F1. So hopefully that's just a one-off. But yeah, of course, F1's return to Australia. There's certainly plenty of positives to take from that. It was record crowds in Australia. I don't know the actual statistics and how they match up to other sports because, of course, the usual caveats apply with Formula 1. Figures being taken over the course of a weekend rather than just a specific day where most events happen in terms of live sport. So, all of that aside, it was a very, very successful weekend for F1's homecoming in Australia a few years after the pandemic, where we haven't been to Melbourne and Albert Park. And of course, there were a lot of changes. The track's been resurfaced. It's been reprofiled, particularly in the middle sector as well. But we still got plenty of great racing and so many great points to talk about. First of which we should discuss another brilliant performance from Charles Leclerc and Ferrari to get his second win of the season to increase his championship lead now to 34 points already after 3 Grand Prix. And I don't think there's much that we can say to add to the brilliance of his performance, Lee. I mean, he was pole position, led every single lap of the race, fastest lap of the race and the race win, completing the Grand Slam. I believe it was Ferrari's first Grand Slam victory since Fernando Alonso in 2012, I believe, or 2010, something like that.
I think it's 2010.
Yeah, you might be right on that one. But 2010, let's go with that one because that sounds a bit more likely from what I remember hearing. But it pretty much summed up, I think perfection in a way, pretty much summed up Charles Leclerc's performance. Lee, I know you always favoured Sainz in the Ferrari camp out of the two, but how impressed were you by Charles Leclerc's performance? And were you surprised by how well he controlled that race?
Well, firstly, I was talking about the car itself. I think this is the first time we've seen Ferrari porpoise a lot along the circuit. It was bouncing quite heavily this weekend compared to the last 2 races where it hasn't bounced as much. So they're obviously putting the ride height a bit lower, and so obviously with the increase in engine that I think it was 5 extra horsepower they unlocked this weekend from the engine. Obviously putting the car into a good stead. But going to answer your question about Charles, yeah, I mean, Charles has always been a fast driver. That's never been in doubt. What has been his Achilles heel is his consistency, either to not make silly mistakes, and really we still question mark about consistency over a season. But he's now had these 2 race wins, and as you said, it's the most dominant one of his career as of yet. and it was a really classy drive, especially when you on the second safety car restart when he messed that up, but he somehow still came out ahead. Which that was for me was the most impressive part of his drive, was he managed to keep Max behind after that scuff of a restart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because, you know, that was the moment. I think if there was any slight error that he had made all weekend, and maybe this season too, by extension, it was certainly that one. I mean, Charles said he just suddenly felt a bit of understeer and the car just lost little bit of grip, probably because the tyres weren't fully up to temperature. But then he managed to recover that and hold on to the position against Max Verstappen, who obviously was trying to go for it because he probably felt, based on the pace of the two drivers and the two cars that they had at the time, it was probably his best chance to try and get ahead of Leclerc and perhaps try to win this race. Of course, that didn't happen. Leclerc managed to hold on to that position relatively well. And then, of course, he said later on in the lap, the grip came back to him and he was practically gone. He was in a completely different league to everybody else today with the machinery that he had and how well he was driving. So I think, as you pointed out, Lee, it's really important to mention when it comes to talking about Charles Leclerc that the biggest issue with him in terms of answering the question if he's capable of sustaining a championship challenge, never mind the machinery, is can he handle the pressure and can he be consistent enough when he's required to get the results that he needs to get. So far, I know it's only been 3 races, but we've already seen that in the big moments, Charles Leclerc has stepped up. He's been able to deliver. I mean, this Grand Prix alone, his pace wasn't exactly spectacular through practice or through qualifying 1 and 2. He was there or thereabouts. We thought there was in a shout. Some went as far as saying perhaps Red Bull could lock out the front row. But then in Q3, he absolutely delivered. He was a quarter of a second faster than anybody else. And throughout the entirety of the Grand Prix, he pretty much had it under control. If anything, it probably flattered the rest of the competition that he was not even further ahead because, of course, that final lap, he wanted to push for fastest lap to maintain that. And he ended up doing it on the final lap, something that we've seen Lewis Hamilton do so often throughout his career. It really does hit home that perhaps this season we are starting to see Charles Leclerc, with all respect to what he's done already, come of age a little bit in the early stages of this season. And perhaps that is something that he will be able to sustain throughout the season. We'll have to wait and see. In terms of Ferrari themselves, Lee, of course, we shouldn't forget how brilliant a job that they have done to, in the early stages of this new era, produce a car that looks, it's fast, it's reliable, it's easy to drive. It seems to be quite forgiving for the drivers when there is a slight mistake that they make. For lack of a better way of putting it, this is the benchmark. And the question remains, can Ferrari sustain that throughout the entirety of the season? And I think that's going to be the question out of them. But so far, what have you made of what Ferrari have done so far, Lee? Is there anything that you can fault them on so far?
Well, obviously the Carlos's weekend unravelled due to Ferrari's issues, not his issue. So you can fault them on that sense of the reliability that it wasn't perfect for Carlos. What was it?
Well, it was 2 issues, wasn't it? Because there was a bit of an issue in Q3 which prevented him from getting that extra warm-up lap. And I think that's been quite significant that they need a second lap, a lot of the field, to get that extra performance, which did cost him a little bit. But then, of course, he had to have a steering wheel change just before the start of the race, and there was an issue with the startup, which explained his very, very poor start off the grid, which sent him down even further.
So yeah, it is obviously the car is the benchmark, but these little niggles of reliability doesn't help the team overall. It obviously has massively hindered Carlos's weekend, and obviously got him frustrated and overdriven the car off the circuit, and that was the end of Carlos's race. But it's these little niggles can be ironed out. Obviously, Ferrari have come in with a blinder of a car. You could almost raise the question of, did their suspect engine in 2019 actually, was it an advantage? Because it put them out of the championship for the next couple of years, and they got to build this monster of a car. So there's one way of looking at it.
Well, we still don't know how good this Ferrari engine is in terms of, but I mean, we know it's reliable, at least at the setting that it's being run at, and at the moment that is enough for them to win 2 Grand Prix and be within half a second of winning the 3rd one that we've had so far. So we know what they have right now is already pretty good, and They did test a new diffuser this weekend, some iterations to the previous version, but I believe they ran the old spec that they ran in Saudi and Bahrain during the race. So that new diffuser, if Ferrari are happy with it, they may bring that to Imola with a few other small updates, nothing significant though. And I think Mattia Binotto was pretty much alluding to the fact that because the car in its most basic iteration for 2022, compared to what it could possibly be throughout the rest of the season, is running so well, there's absolutely no reason to try and rush to put upgrades on the car. They can afford to take their time on this whilst they still have that margin. And I think that perhaps, not necessarily conservative, but non-aggressive rushing approach that Ferrari seem to be taking right now could, hopefully for their sake, only serve them as it has done already. So that's really encouraging to see. You mentioned earlier that they'd added a little bit of extra power. I think of as much as 5 brake horsepower, which isn't a massive amount, but it's could be like half a tenth here or there. And obviously that's proven to work out so far because the reliability figures have been good for Ferrari. So right now it does seem that this car, not to get too ahead of ourselves here, because I could have a tendency to do that being a Ferrari fan, but it does seem right now that the car is fast. It's practically bulletproof to a large degree, at least what Leclerc's been having right now. And compared to everyone else, the issues that everyone else has been happening, what Ferrari have is relatively small fry and not difficult to get on top of. So right now, it's looking increasingly likely. I mean, I'm going to pop the question to you right now, Lee. Again, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but at this point, is Charles Leclerc right now the heavy favourite for the championship, even though we've only had 3 races?
I would probably say it's too early to say. But if we're leaving Miami, which is only a couple of races' time, and heading back to Europe with Charles with another 2 wins, then yeah, slam dunk for sure. We never know. All right, Max is now 2 wins behind, for example. But if Max gets 2 wins on the trot, he starts to close that gap, and it does raise the question. So I think it's too early to say that he's the heavy favourite. It's looking that way. But we just have to see how the next couple of races go in regards to Charles's run for the championship.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, for me, I put it down to, is there really anybody else in the field right now that I could pick out that has the machinery and is driving to the level that it would be enough to challenge Charles if Charles Leclerc keeps driving the way that he is? But as you said, of course, if he comes away from the next few Grand Prix with two more wins under his belt, then it's the lead that he already has. I mean, we're talking about a 34-point gap. For those of you that aren't aware, to put it into perspective, neither Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton had a lead that huge at any point last season in 2021. And I think if anyone was to claw that back, or if Max Verstappen, for example, was to claw that deficit back, and he looks like the most likely challenger right now to Leclerc, if anybody, he's got to claw back 46 points to Leclerc. That's the 6th largest total that anyone has had to overcome to win a world championship. And that hasn't happened for some time. For perspective, Lewis Hamilton has not had to claw back a lead of that size at any point in his F1 career to win a world championship, and been able to do that. So it just goes to show right now the level of dominance and how good Ferrari and Leclerc have been, at least on this side of the garage so far. Again, really early days, but it looks very, very encouraging for Ferrari and Charles Leclerc. On Sainz quickly, it is worth mentioning that there were a few issues that did plague him, but this was a weekend that he really needed to try and put together a strong performance. And even though he was a bit unfortunate with the red flag in qualifying caused by Alonso's crash, which probably would have put him 4th on the grid if he was able to complete that lap, and the issues that he had before the race, the mistake that he made proved to be quite a costly one, Lee. And based on the pace and what we saw at Leclerc, and you could argue that Sainz could have at least been a 10th or 2 a lap off of Leclerc, he still probably would have had enough pace, considering the way the race panned out, to probably get on the podium. It just shows how quick that car was and how quick Leclerc was in it. Sainz could have done something to a similar degree if he'd managed to get everything together. So how disappointed do you think Carlos Sainz will be with that error on lap 2, which saw him out of the race after such a difficult weekend already?
Yeah, I think he'll be quite disappointed and frustrated with himself. He knows the race-ending incident for him was his mistake, and he knows he can drive better than how he's currently driving. So it's going to be very frustrating on his part that for whatever reason he's just not driving at the best of his capability. And until he gets on top of whatever's causing him these frustrations, be it if it's a mental frustration or there's something in the new car, it's just not quite his liking, he needs to get on top of it. But he's going to be disappointed and frustrated with himself, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely so. And I think the reason why I bring this up with Carlos Sainz is because after the first race, despite getting second place, his best result this season, he was quite disappointed about the fact that he felt that he was quite a bit off of Charles. He thought he needed to be on that level. He looked like he had the pace where he could be, but it didn't work out for him. Saudi Arabia, again, it wasn't too bad, but he was still a little bit off his teammate. He obviously wanted to come to this Grand Prix with the hope that he could have the pace to challenge his teammate and possibly try to win this Grand Prix. And it looked like in qualifying that he was going to do that. Of course, he had those issues. And then obviously what happened in the race was, there for everybody to see. It was a disappointment. Now, the reason why I think this is significantly is because with 3 races in, Charles Leclerc has a huge lead in the championship already. Carlos Sainz is the nearest realistic contender to him at the moment, if you not include George Russell, with all due respect to Mercedes at this point in time. They just don't have the machinery right now to do that. He's already 38 points off of his teammate. It already gets to the point where we have to perhaps start asking the question that, will Ferrari consider potentially putting Carlos Sainz in that number 2 role to support Leclerc's championship charge now? Because I think Ferrari know they have a car and a driver capable of taking points off of Max Verstappen. But if we end up in a situation where Carlos Sainz is leading a Grand Prix, Leclerc is right behind him and Max Verstappen is in third, what are the chances that Ferrari may decide to pull the trigger already and ask Carlos to move over for Charles? And for anyone who thinks that this is massively premature and that Ferrari wouldn't do it, let's remember, this is Ferrari. This is the team that literally will go to any length to try and guarantee their number 1 driver an opportunity at a championship, no matter how unlikely it could be. They're now in a position where potentially they could end up. This is probably the best chance they've got winning a championship. As I said, early days, but what are your thoughts, Lee? Do you think Ferrari could consider doing that already after what we saw this weekend?
I'm sure it's crossing their minds. And also, would raise question, will Carlos follow that team order if he was told to swap places? Obviously, he's contextual if Max is 5 seconds down the road from Charles, or he's all over Charles's gearbox, because slowing down in that situation could quite go from being P1 for Carlos to P3 for Carlos. So there is that contextual situation that has to be in mind. But I'm sure Carlos will win a race at some point this year. And he knows that this may be his best chance for a championship. So it's a bit more like the potentially going towards the Lewis and Nico Rosberg situation. If Ferrari is by far the contender for the year, and you'll get Mercedes occasionally in the way at the moment, or you get Max and Sergio getting involved, will Carlos give way to Charles when they have the best car and he thinks he can close the gap? He gets a few wins. Max happens to be P2, Charles is P3, for example. That gap will quickly close if you're knocking 10 points off every race. So it's not over yet for Carlos.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, as I said, I don't think Ferrari will do it just yet. But given what happened this weekend for Sainz, the last thing he would have wanted was a DNF, especially when, as I said, there was a possibility that he could have recovered it and got at least a podium. I think the pace was there, and I think he would have been capable of doing it. But that's how it goes sometimes, and it was obviously a difficult day for him. So hopefully he can recover from that fairly quickly. Let's move on to Red Bull. Again, contrasting fortunes for their drivers, but overall, this proved to be quite a difficult weekend for Red Bull, even though they got a P2 with Sergio Perez and arguably would have been a double podium if Max Verstappen was able to finish. But even if we take away the reliability issues, Red Bull just didn't have the pace. It was quite surprising how far they were off Ferrari and Charles Leclerc in particular over the course of this weekend. I mean, Friday practice, they looked like they were going to be on par. If anything, Red Bull looked like they had a little tiny bit in hand. Qualifying, it looked like they might be able to cement that as well. It didn't happen. There were mistakes made by the drivers. The car just wasn't really hooking up. And then throughout the race, not only did they not seem to have the pace over the long stints, but they had huge issues with graining on those medium tyres. Both drivers were complaining of it. Max Verstappen in particular was the first one to complain about graining issues. And if anything, I think an accurate assessment of Red Bull's pace this weekend is that they were racing Mercedes more than they were actually racing Ferrari. What are your thoughts on Red Bull this weekend, Lee?
Oh no, you got it in the sentence that they were racing Mercedes and not Ferrari, and the fact, admittedly, Charles was slowly pulling away. He wasn't disappearing into the distance. He was slowly pulling away, but the Red Bulls weren't able to drop the Mercedes like the last two Grand Prix. There was a point that Lewis was coming back at Sergio before his first pit stop, which shows you how bad the tyres life was getting on that Red Bull. That gap was closing, and even towards the end of the race, the gap was slowly closing down to Sergio as his tyres started to fade. Again, obviously going off the track didn't help, closing that gap down to George. But obviously, apart from the engine concern that they now have, do they also have concern about their tyre wear?
Well, this is it, because I think this is an inherent issue with Red Bull as well, not just a reliability, but I think this car does tend to chew up its tyres more than the others. I think we saw a little bit of that in Bahrain. I think Ferrari kind of knew this, and maybe that explained why they went with a high downforce setup in Jeddah, but Ferrari obviously made a mistake in calculating how bad the tyre wear was going to be. I think it just didn't turn out to be as bad as we thought, which obviously gave Red Bull that opportunity to win that race. And I think we've seen at Australia, I think perhaps with the resurface and the track may have played a part in this, but Red Bull really struggled to look after their tyres, and it really cost them, as you said, towards the end of the stint, to the point where Perez looked like he dropped Russell and Hamilton after a poor start. Hamilton was coming back at him, and that was because the Mercedes guys were looking after the tyres a lot better than Red Bull were, and it really caused them to struggle. On the subject of reliability, Lee, because we have to talk about this is now the second DNF for Max Verstappen in 3 races. It's already proven to be quite difficult for Max Verstappen on pace alone to defend his championship, with Charles Leclerc and Ferrari looking practically bulletproof and fast to boot so far. But another issue for Red Bull, Christian Horner was saying it's probably something to do with a fuel leak, not necessarily the same issue that they were plagued with in Bahrain, but there was another issue that could potentially have ended their race that they were managing as well. So what are your thoughts on this right now with Red Bull? Because it seems to me that not only do they not have a car that is the fastest car in the field, I think that's quite evident from what we've seen so far that it's only the second fastest, but it's also not very reliable when Red Bull try to push it to its absolute maximum. So with that being said, how are Red Bull, in your mind, going to be able to fight Ferrari when they've got a car that's not as fast as theirs on most circuits and also nowhere near as reliable at the moment?
Well, we know Adrian Newey is very good at designing cars, but sometimes they don't turn out to be completely reliable regarding packaging. Obviously, there is now the Red Bull powertrain. There may be some handover that hasn't gone as planned, or the fuels, or some of the development push isn't gone to plan. It brings back, I can't remember, is it 2003 or 2004, the Adrian Newey McLaren?
Yes.
Yeah. I can't remember which season it was, but
I think
Kimi
it was 2005, wasn't it?
Oh,
Kimi
okay,
was just
5,
lightning,
sorry.
and he had reliability issues. Yeah, you're right.
And it just reminds me of that. You can build a very fast car, but you lose the championship if you don't finish the race. And I mean, Christian said after the race that he'd rather have an unreliable fast car than a reliable slow car. However, to me, Mercedes have at the moment a reliable slow car, but they're higher than Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. So the facts speak for themselves in that sense. So I don't know what Christian was talking on about there.
Well, that's going to hurt them, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
They probably looked at Bahrain and saw the pace in the Mercedes and thought, oh man, we're going to leave them in the dust. This is going to be fun, just us and Ferrari for the time being. And then after 3 Grand Prix where Red Bull have clearly had the pace to win, or at least be in the hunt to win all 3 races to a degree. And you could argue that they were fortunate to come away with just the one, really. And Mercedes are still ahead of them in the constructors because they're maximising their results. And who is it, Michael Schumacher, that said, in order to finish first you have to finish? And that seems to be the mantra that Red Bull need to focus on, rather than getting their chest out saying that the car is fast but it can't finish. I mean, that's no good to anybody.
No, and obviously they've got some issues to focus on. And with Max, I do raise the question of how long until Max gets frustrated and his frustration starts showing in his driving and he starts making reckless decisions regarding his lunges, like we saw last year. So, yeah, it just raises that question regarding how long until we get a Max and Charles incident.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, so far, they've raced pretty well together. It's been hard,
Yes,
but fair racing. I mean, I was half expecting Max Verstappen to make a lunge on Leclerc going into turn 1 at the second safety car because there was an opportunity there and Leclerc covered it off really, really well. But it almost feels like there's an inevitability about it with some desperation where that may creep back into Max's driving and we may see quite a serious incident between the two, which could obviously change the way that they fight each other in the same way that it did with Lewis last season. So, you know, remains to be seen how that goes. Right now, of course, Red Bull's problem is reliability. I think there's no doubt that their car is quick. They're obviously going to have to figure out how to get that car going at all circuits where they don't have more issues with the tyres that they've had this weekend. It really did plague them on performance. So, you know, I think we're just going to have to take this one race at a time with Red Bull. But right now, as far as Max Verstappen's championship challenge is concerned, I don't even think Max is overly confident. I think he said the way things are going right now, we're probably going to need 45 races to catch Leclerc the way things are going rather than the 20 that we have left. I suppose the only saving grace for them is that we still have 20 Grand Prix left. So there's plenty of time for things to change. And if anything, from what we saw last season, it really isn't over until it's over.
It's definitely not over till it's over. And I think, was it 2012 that Sebastian Vettel managed to claw back a 41-point deficit after the summer break?
That's right.
So we obviously got a long way to go to the summer break, but even a 41-point deficit at the summer break, it can be done. So
it can be done, absolutely. The one thing, though, that Sebastian Vettel had over Fernando Alonso that Max Verstappen right now, exactly, he doesn't have a faster car than Charles Leclerc right now, and to boot, he doesn't have a more reliable car than Leclerc, not even close. So a lot is going to have to change. And again, look, let's not get carried away. I know it's quite easy for you, anyone listening to this podcast, thinking that we've already said Leclerc is going to be the 2022 world champion. But as I said, plenty of time to go, and we'll have to wait and see how things develop. A quick note on Sergio Perez's race. He had similar issues to what Max dealt with in terms of the tyre wear and everything else. But I think overall, Sergio drove a pretty solid race. And I think P2 for him was a pretty handy reward for his performance this weekend. Another solid weekend for Checo, it must be said, Lee.
Yeah, I was quite impressed with his drive. This car, is, like I've said in previous episodes, this car or this generation of car suits Sergio more. Maybe it was that the other car, the previous year's car, was more suited to Max's driving. But we're now seeing Sergio very close in performance levels to Max, which is nice to see. And there was a point that you go in qualifying, Sergio was obviously the faster driver through qualifying. So I was like, is Sergio going to be ahead of Max in qualifying? Will Sergio get a race win? And they have 2 race wins. And so I'm sure he will get that race win this year. But yeah, it was just a pleasant, impressive drive from Sergio, bringing that back and unfortunately for him, fighting with Mercedes and not the Ferrari.
Yeah. You know, it must be said, it wasn't the easiest weekend for Perez in that regard, but I think he did a pretty good job. He was, as I said, he was less than a tenth off of Max in Q3. He probably could have got a little bit more out of the car. I don't think it would have been fair to say that he would have got Leclerc because the lap Leclerc put in was absolutely brilliant, particularly in the final sector. And as I said, you know, in qualifying alone, Max and Charles were pretty much neck and neck until the final corners, turn 13, I think it was, or something like that, where Ferrari gained most of its advantage. So, you know, it's still there for Red Bull. And Perez has done a great job so far. I think he's doing more than what I think Red Bull expected. And perhaps you're rightly, this new car is really helping Perez to settle in. And we're starting to see Sergio Perez do what we hoped he would do in Red Bull. So another good weekend for him. He's just got to keep doing what he's doing right now, because right now he's doing the job for Red Bull, whereas his teammate just needs a car that can finish a Grand Prix. Let's move on to Mercedes. This is going to be a weird one to interpret with Mercedes, because I think, first of all, incredible drive and result from both of their drivers. George Russell getting his first podium for the team. Sir Lewis Hamilton, I should say, a solid P4 for the team as well. He'll be a little bit disappointed, Lewis, on the P4, because it could have easily been P3 if it wasn't for the safety car caused by Sebastian Vettel's crash earlier in the race. So, overall, Lee, how would you rate Mercedes this weekend? It definitely was damage limitation. I'd say they pretty much did the maximum and beyond that from what they were probably expecting.
Yeah, no, it was Bahrain again. It was a perfect example of damage limitation, maximising the points they had available to them. Very solid drive from both drivers and bringing back the points.
Yeah, and, Lewis was a little bit disappointed at the end of the race. He was saying on the team radio throughout the final stint that you put me in this position, and now he wasn't happy about that. I think for reference, for those of you that probably need a little bit of context, he was talking about the overheating issues with the car rather than the fact that he was out, unfortunately, behind George Russell owing to the safety car. There was nothing Mercedes could have done about that. It's not like they manipulated it and put him behind George Russell deliberately. It's just when the safety car came out, Lewis had just lost a place to Perez and George had benefited from a pit stop under the safety car, so he was able to leapfrog the pair of them. So, you can't really take that as Hamilton having a dig at Mercedes. It was, and he explained this after the race. That's what the context was for. It was overheating issues, so he couldn't stay close to George and try and attack him at the end of the race. That would have been a fun battle to watch. But I think right now Mercedes, they're doing the right thing in terms of managing the race. I think in qualifying, George Russell said that they were probably the 5th fastest car, and yet they've ended up 3rd and 4th. I'm not sure if that's entirely true. I think they were probably a little bit better, but it just took Mercedes a while to get on top of that, and I think they set the car up for the race rather than qualifying specifically. But they are managing this situation as well as they can. They're putting points on the board. They're putting themselves in a good position for when they're in a position where the car is more competitive. They can try and take advantage of that. But I'm still wondering how long it's going to take Mercedes to catch up to not only Red Bull on race pace, but Ferrari as well. Because I think right now, Leclerc compared to the two Mercedes guys, they're giving up 0.8 to a second a lap on race pace. And I don't think they were any closer to the lead pace than where they were in Bahrain. I think it's kind of inflated a little bit or flattered a little bit because of the fact that Red Bull had clearly dropped off. I think that was the reason for why it looked a little bit better than it is. So, again, that's my assessment on it. I think Mercedes, they're in a good position, but I don't think they're any closer to the lead car than they were in Bahrain, despite trying to understand their car better, if that makes sense. What was your assessment on that, Lee? Would you agree with that, or do you think that perhaps they are making small gains?
I generally agree with your statement that it was flattered by Red Bull being closer to Mercedes than Ferrari. I do think the team are making small gains regarding their understanding of the car. But the longer it takes them to get on top of this car, the more time Ferrari and Red Bull have time to develop the car further away from the current point of reference. So Toto Wolff keeps saying that, we're now in the wind tunnel, there's a second a lap in this car, and we just need to solve our problems and we'll get that second basically unlocked. But if it takes them 3 months to get that second unlocked, and Ferrari and Red Bull have added quarter of a second, well, I'm sure it's supposed to be that big a game, but just for an example in this point of a quarter of a second onto their car, they're still going to be behind because they're further behind the development. So it really is for Mercedes game on to get their issues sorted. If they haven't got an upgrade that unlocks some of this potential by Barcelona, which already by that point would be the 6th race of the season, that's it. They're going to be too far behind to realistically fight for a championship, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like I'm going to spend the majority of this episode trying to write down what's going to happen for the rest of the season already and write teams off.
Sorry.
I have confidence that Mercedes can definitely get themselves into a position where they potentially are challenging for race wins. I just don't think that that's going to happen anywhere near as quickly as some people think. I mean, we had Ben Hunt, the F1 journalist, on here for the preview, and he predicted that Mercedes could potentially win the British Grand Prix. It's a sort of July time. Just before the summer break, which I don't think is an unreasonable prediction. But then if it was me, I don't think it will be that soon. I think Mercedes still need to understand their car a little bit better. And even if, as you said, Lee, they find that magic 1 second extra in performance over the course of a lap during a race, if they do that, that's assuming that Ferrari is standing still. That will put them right there where they are now. And even now, Ferrari still got porpoising issues to sort out because that was quite bad what was happening there. But although they just dealt with it quite easily, it's just a testament to how well their car is that they can handle that. And as long as the drivers are okay, that's all that matters. And they still have engine performance to unlock in that Ferrari as well that they haven't used yet because they're still waiting to see if it's reliable. So with all that being said, at the very, very least, it's going to put them in that sort of part between Ferrari and Red Bull, and that's assuming the other two are standing still, which of course they're not going to do. So I just think that if I was a Mercedes fan, I would listen to what George Russell is saying. I would listen to what Lewis is saying. I would listen to what Toto is saying, that this is going to take some time. Will they figure it out? Absolutely. Of course they will. It's Mercedes. They're going to do it. If anyone can do it, it's them. But I just don't think at this point in time that there's a likelihood that they're going to produce a car that could eventually challenge for this season's World Championship. I think they will be there, but it will be too late for them to make up the ground unless something crazy happens where Ferrari and Red Bull just drop points like crazy. I just don't think they're going to have the championship winning car in time to win this season's championship. But of course, it will bode well for them in future seasons. So I don't think all is lost just yet. So we'll have to keep an eye on Mercedes on that one. But otherwise, I think they drove really, really well today, or in the race at least. Just a quick note on George Russell, because we didn't talk too much about him. What have you made of George Russell so far this season, Lee? Because, it was a solid P5, or was it, no, P4, I should say, in Bahrain, P5 in Saudi, drove pretty well there, and a podium today. He's been mega impressive for me, and it's culminated in him being second in the Drivers' Championship right now. So, kudos to George Russell right now.
He's driving impressively. I mean, I'm sure Courtney and I, and even probably even yourself, we mentioned it in the predictions or the preview for this year's season. I can't remember, so if I'm completely making it up, I do apologise. But or at least I said, that I expect him to sit into the team or fit into the team and just get on with it because he's been a part of that family for so long, and he's proving that he's just part of the team. He's understanding it and he's getting straight on with it. And we're not seeing a pressure scenario between Lewis and George as of yet. They seem to be working well together. But let's see how long that lasts.
Yeah, absolutely right. We'll have to wait and see how long that lasts. But it's going well so far for George, so hopefully long may that continue. And of course, who knows? He might be challenging for race wins like Sir Lewis hopefully will be doing very, very soon. So we'll wait and see how that goes. Let's move on to McLaren. By far their best weekend in 2022. Some have put it down to perhaps being it was just track specific where the car was good. We know the McLaren has had problems in the slower corners. We saw that a lot in Bahrain and in Jeddah to a degree as well. But this weekend they turned up and they seem to get it all together. It looks like that some of the bigger issues that have plagued the car early days they've been able to get on top of to some degree. But otherwise, I would say that's pretty much as good a weekend as they possibly could have hoped for. There was a little bit of an issue for Lando Norris that he had to manage towards the end, which of course I'd say drifted them away from Mercedes because, of course, Ricciardo had to play the team game and just stay behind Lando towards the end. But otherwise, I'd say McLaren were pretty much superb. And like Mercedes, the only other team to get both their cars in the points this weekend.
Yep, it was a completely solid drive from McLaren. And more importantly, I think it was a very solid drive for Daniel. Yes, he had played the team game, but firstly, Daniel scored a good result in Australia, which unfortunately for him, he hasn't had many chances to score a good result in Australia. I think he normally DNFs when he was driving for Red Bull, if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I think there was one race where he was actually won, but then of course it didn't give back a correct fuel sample or something like that, so he got disqualified, which was obviously very unpopular with the local crowd.
He's had a lot of bad luck in Australia. But I think most important aspect is now 3 races in, and Daniel has been there or thereabouts with Lando in this car, which means the struggles we had last year with Daniel seems to have been resolved, and we're now getting. Well, this weekend we had a 2x2 for McLaren, so your drivers are maximising the potential when they're side by side on track the entire race distance.
Yeah, not to burst their bubble too much, but do you think that this was one of those races where, the Australian Grand Prix circuit is quite unique and, of course, a resurfacing. So could this result have also been as a result of the fact that this is a track-specific circuit for some cars?
I think it is a bit of track specificness. I think part of it was because it was not overly hot compared to the Middle East tracks we've come from the last two races. Obviously, they've got onto some of their issues. Some other teams were having issues, like the Haas and the Alfa Romeo and the AlphaTauri. So it's too early to say McLaren are back as being the full fastest team. But they maximised the result they could get for this weekend, which is the most important thing in a team in their position has to do. Obviously, for them, it's see how they going towards the European leg of the season, minus the trips to North America throughout the European leg of the season, before we reach the American leg of the season later on in the year. But yeah, I think it was a solid drive from both drivers. And that, apart from the start where Lando slipped back behind both Mercedes, you couldn't really fault their weekend. Another solid 2 fast pit stops as well. I can't remember if it was the fastest pit stops of the...
I believe it was the fastest one of the weekend, yeah. I mean, on average, I think they are second behind Ferrari, but it's like 1,000th of a second. So they're pretty much on par with the best team in the pits right now. So that's a great thing for McLaren as well.
Yeah, so they're getting their operational side of things together. So yeah, it's just a solid weekend for McLaren.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And, and again, Lando was a great qualifying performance. Daniel was pretty much there as well. So it's good to see both of their drivers are performing to the max that they can get out of the car. I think that could be fair to be said about both guys throughout this season so far. So, let's get on the hype train for Danny Ric. He certainly looks like he's a lot more competitive this season. That can only be good for McLaren, and long may that continue for them. Let's move on to Alpine. A big mix of fortunes. Huge contrast between the weekends between Ocon and Fernando Alonso. I want to start with Esteban Ocon, given that he got the bigger result this weekend. P7 was managing some issues towards the end, for the second half of the race, really. He was struggling with some issues with his car, but he managed to bring it home and get a solid P7. Overall, if you were Alpine, would you be happy with that? Because I think it's probably fair to say that they probably had the third fastest car going into this weekend.
I think they would be disappointed with the result they had got this weekend. Obviously, Ocon scored some nice points towards the end, but yeah, it's not what they would have expected based on how the practice went, and even the kind of laps they potentially. I know we don't like talking about 2/3 of a lap and things like that, but the lap Fernando was going on, that would have been brilliant. A nice qualifying position.
Yeah, it was brilliant for what it was worth, because wasn't he like 800ths off of Charles Leclerc's pole lap? Yeah, and at the time when he was doing it, he was actually up on Leclerc as well. So yeah, what a lap that would have been if he finished it. But
we don't like talking about 2/3 of a lap.
No, we do not. We do not.
The fastest 2/3 of a lap.
Well, I think we'll have to have a separate list for the fastest almost qualifying laps in history, and Max Verstappen's Saudi lap in 2021 and Fernando's lap at Melbourne this season. It's getting there. The list is starting to take shape.
But yeah, I think it was very disappointing for them. Obviously, the strategy didn't work with the safety car. Although Alonso, I know we're talking about Esteban, but Fernando drove brilliantly, but the strategy just didn't work. Esteban made most of a bad qualifying and got himself into some good points. It's just not what the team would have expected, unfortunately, for them.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't too bad for Ocon. I mean, it was P8, but I know what you mean. He could have done a bit more. It was just one of them weekends where Fernando was just absolutely mighty. He looked really impressive in qualifying. He could have even got himself on the front row. As I said, we don't often like talking about these kind of situations, like would he or wouldn't he? But, from what we saw, he could have got himself on the front row of the grid alongside Charles Leclerc. That certainly would have been a story for Fernando Alonso, the wily old fox. Rolling back the years, I believe it was 2001 where he made his debut for the Minardi team at Melbourne. So to come back here and put together that kind of performance to a degree would have been phenomenal. But it was just a weekend of bad fortune for him. He had that hydraulics issues, which obviously played towards that crash. He wasn't able to rely on the engine braking when he wanted to shift up into, I believe it was, shift down into third gear through that sharp corner that's been reprofiled, of course. And it was catching a lot of people out, and it caught Fernando out in qualifying when he pushed for it. And then, of course, in the race, he started on the harder tyres. He started off relatively well, but the safety cars completely ruined that one-stop strategy for him. And, of course, when he was on the mediums trying to claw back those places, he didn't look after the tyres well, and he suffered massive graining towards the end of the race, which saw him go all the way down to the back of the field, where I think he was last of all the finished runners, which obviously won't be something to brag about. So certainly a weekend for Alpine where they could have got so much more, and particularly for Alonso, he might have had the pace to get on the podium this weekend. He was looking that quick, and it just never really worked out, but that's Formula One for you sometimes. Obviously, now they've dropped behind McLaren in the Constructors' Championship, it must be said as well. So, of course, they're not going to be too happy about that one. Let's move on to talk about Alfa Romeo. Valtteri Bottas. Bit of a recovery weekend for Valtteri Bottas because he qualified outside, failed to get into Q3. The first time he's failed to do that in 103 races, which ends a very long streak, one that stretched back almost 5 seasons now, which was obviously rather disappointing. And I think Valtteri knew he had the pace to get into Q3 this weekend, just didn't put it together when he needed to. But otherwise, other than one little moment with Lance Stroll towards the end of the race, he did a rather good job to recover and get into P8. So I think we can put that one down as another positive weekend for Valtteri Bottas in the Alfa Romeo. He's certainly looking like a brand new man right now, and certainly a better one.
Yeah, well, Valtteri 4.0, 5.0, whatever we.
Well, I think we've got it up to. I think we established it was 7.7, and that's kind of
okay. That's it. 7.7.
That's kind of on the nose for his car number. I think it's appropriate. So
yeah, I think it's appropriate too. I forgot there was 7.7. We labeled 7.7. No, yeah, he does seem a new man at Alfa Romeo. Obviously the Stroll pushing him off the track, that wasn't pushing him off the track because obviously Stroll's ruled it wasn't a penalising incident. It felt a bit of justice for Bottas when he got back ahead of Gasly and Stroll. So I was like, well, you got pushed off, but you're back in the same position. So that's good to see. That's that was a nice little smile moment for me for him.
To whom it may concern, perhaps.
Yeah. But no, he just drove a solid weekend anyway. Out the limelight and out the pressure pot. I think we're starting to see the rebirth of Valtteri that we saw at Williams all those years ago. So it's nice to see that he's there.
Yeah, he certainly seems a man reinvigorated by this new challenge at Alfa Romeo. And I remember a lot of people, ourselves included, felt he should have gone to Williams, and that seemed like the natural fit. But obviously he knew something that the rest of us didn't, and why wouldn't he? He's the man on the inside when it comes to these sorts of things. What do we know? But
he wanted the Ferrari engine.
Exactly. That's what it was. Somehow he obviously had faith that Ferrari were going to produce a mega engine, and here we are. But the Alpha car on its own looks pretty quick, and he's doing a great job. It seems that, we had Raikkonen and Giovinazzi who had different strengths, albeit weren't as consistent as perhaps Alpha would have liked them to be in terms of qualifying and race pace. It seems that Valtteri Bottas has got the best of both mixes in this, and he's delivering on a regular basis. And I think this season, that is what's going to be so critical for his season and also for Alfa Romeo. So right now, they've certainly got a driver in that car that's happy with his new role. He's leading the team. He's the man that they're coming to. He's the man that they need to deliver, and they're putting all their eggs in that basket, and he's doing a great job. So I'm really happy to see it, and I hope it continues for Valtteri. He's doing a great job so far.
Oh yeah, completely agree. Long may it continue for Valtteri. Come on, hit 7.7. We don't want to get 8.7 because that just ruins our...
Oh, yeah. No, I think we'll stick with 7.7 for a while. I think that's a good version. We won't need to upgrade or update that. I think we're good there. Any other Valtteri puns that anyone can think of, do send them in to us. We'd be very, very grateful. We'll read some of the best ones out in a future episode. Why not? Guan Yu Zhou. Not a bad weekend for Guan Yu Zhou. He was a bit down in qualifying, but finishes P11. He seems to like P11. Valtteri Bottas. We had a running joke with Alfa Romeo finishing in P12 and P11. Zhou seems to have continued that for 2022. This is his second P11 in a row. It would have been 3 if it wasn't for the late changeover in Bahrain. We managed to slip into the top 10. So what have you made of him? I mean, even though it's no points this weekend, it's still a relatively decent performance.
Well, I think once again he gets my award for the best rookie of the race.
Yeah, it's a very, very packed, tight field this year for Rookie of the Season, it must be said. But yeah, I'll probably agree with you on that one.
No, he's driving pretty well. I mean, I didn't have my hopes up for him, admittedly, coming into the season, but he's been driven consistently and impressively in the midfield. He's not lazing around the back. He's not doing silly mistakes. He's keeping a solid drive together, and it's all right. He's not got the speed of Valtteri, but Valtteri is a veteran of the sport now. But no, he's just another impressive drive in his third race in Formula One. It's can't fault the guy.
No, me neither. I think I've been pretty happy with what he's done so far. Hopefully he can get a bit more luck and try and get a few more points here or there. But so far, not a bad start for Guan Yu Zhou, or Zhou Guan Yu, I should say. Settled in quite well. Let's move on to AlphaTauri. 9th place for Pierre Gasly today. 15th for Yuki Tsunoda. I keep saying today, we're recording this on the Monday. Again, this seems to be where AlphaTauri seem to find themselves, on the fringes of points. Now, on the surface of it, as we look back on this season, it may not turn out to be a bad thing for AlphaTauri, but last year they were fighting for potentially 5th or 6th, or maybe even more than that at most circuits, and they've certainly gone down right now, and it seems to be because Pierre Gasly in particular is putting together great performances in the race that are going relatively unknown. I think the only time I really saw Gasly in this race is when he went off at the final corner, or penultimate corner, I should say, when he was holding on to P8, which allowed Bottas to get back in. And of course, his involvement with that free-raid battle with Bottas and Stroll towards the end. So, with all that being said, Lee, I mean, can AlphaTauri be happy about where they are at the moment? It doesn't seem right now that they'd be overly satisfied, but there's Gasly's still scoring points right now, and that could prove to be important.
Yeah, I don't think they'll be, as you said, completely happy with where they are and what they expected going into this weekend. Obviously, we don't know if some of the reliability issues that Red Bull was suffering with their Red Bull powertrain may be having some unknown issues that we're not being privy to regarding the operation in AlphaTauri. But as Gasly, Pierre is just putting out the results with the machinery he's got, and just another solid drive from him. Although the team has, as you said, has slipped a little bit compared to last season. So has Mercedes. So yeah, he's another solid drive from him. It's just Yuki needs to get up there a bit more and towards the more midfield instead of being towards the bottom of the midfield.
Yeah, I mean, Yuki's qualifying pace wasn't too bad. He was only 2 tenths off of Gasly, which was on qualifying. He was, I think it was 14th, and Gasly was 12th. So it wasn't too bad, but in the race again, a little bit underwhelming. And of course, he made that mistake, which of course caused Gasly to go off as well. That's obviously what the cause was. We just didn't see it on the replay. So it's caused them to drop a few points here or there, but right now, it does seem Tsunoda, he's not too bad, but I think he just needs to find a little bit more in the race pace at the moment, because that seems to be costing them. And Gasly seems to be doing the best that he absolutely can. On the subject of the engines, you brought that up, and I think it's a good point, because right now we saw the issue that Gasly had with the MG UK, I believe it was, or MGH, one of the two, in Bahrain. Since then, they've had no reliability issues like that, whereas Red Bull, the sister team, have had a plethora of issues with the car and stuff related to the to the engine and the fuel and etc. I mean, is that going to be a concern for Red Bull? Because it's quite easy to look at these issues in isolation, and and you look for comparisons between the two teams, and perhaps we've got a situation right now where AlphaTauri are not trying to run beyond the spec of what Honda are prescribing to them if it is an engine issue, and Red Bull are trying to run over that or push too much, which is causing all these issues for both their cars. So, I mean, is there a lot that we can learn from the fact that AlphaTauri seem to be more reliable right now than the sister team?
Well, potentially. I mean, as one of the aspects as you've already touched on could be the engine modes they're running. Obviously, if there is a difference in engine mode between Red Bull and AlphaTauri, Red Bull will be aware of that, and then they go, okay, maybe we'll need to dial it down just to bring the results back. But then that opens up the gap to Ferrari. But if it's not an engine mode, it could be just a simple packaging that the Red Bull is too tightly packaged and it's overheating or causing other issues that the AlphaTauri doesn't have because it's just not as tightly packaged. So there's probably other reasons as well that I can't think of off the top of my head right now. But it's the point of reference that Red Bull can look at. But AlphaTauri may have concerns about the engine being they have the same engine. Obviously, they want to bring back the points as well, and they don't want to have their engines stop popping on them as well. So they'll be asking questions of Red Bull powertrains to make sure that their engines remain reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more on that one. Sorry about that. Just sort of pause for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. It's something that I think we need to keep an eye on because I think obviously in Bahrain we saw both teams have issues, and since then AlphaTauri have been fine, whereas Red Bull are still having these problems that they're managing, and ones that we haven't even seen yet that they seem to be dealing with on top of that. So yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that one. I want to move on to Haas, if I may. Obviously, you normally go down the order depending on who finishes where, but Haas 13th and 14th today. Mick Schumacher, for the first time this season, beating Kevin Magnussen. Although Magnussen, of course, he had a bit of illness to deal with, and he had an off or two during the race, which didn't help. But quite surprised to see that Haas never really looked like challenging for the points this weekend. Is this one of those races that track specific that they just really did struggle to get the setup right? Because that seemed to be what Gunther Steiner was saying, Lee. He felt that they just never really got the setup right.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're talking about Haas, but McLaren potentially this is track specific. It worked in their favour. For Haas, being track specific worked against them, which may have helped McLaren obviously be further up the field because there's not another team in the way. But for Haas, working it against them, being Melbourne is a specific type of circuit, I don't think they need to worry too much. It's just one of those results that's just not gone their way, and I'm sure they'll be higher up the field come Imola. Obviously, Kevin was a bit scruffy. He's not normally as scruffy, but as you said, dealing with illness. I mean, everyone, when they're ill, wherever job you do, you're not going to work to your best. It's just one of those things, unfortunately.
Yeah, very much so. But I suppose the one positive you can take from it, despite it not being an ideal weekend by Haas's new loftier standards, and rightly so, is that Mick Schumacher was able to beat his teammate this weekend. So, of course, any confidence that he can get from that will certainly be worth taking for him. So, yeah, we'll have to take that for what it is. And it's good to see that Mick's okay after that big crash that he had in Jeddah. Let's talk about Aston Martin before we move on to Williams, because I do want to save Williams to the end for obviously the right reasons. But Aston Martin, probably one of the most difficult weekends that they've had since they've come into Formula One. I want to start with Sebastian Vettel because this was meant to be the big story. Sebastian Vettel making his long-awaited return after being out with COVID, and we thought, how would Seb be? How would he feel? Would it affect his driving? Because of course he has missed the first two races, but we felt that he'd done a lot of running and testing anyway, so he probably should be okay. And this is a circuit that he does enjoy racing at. He was, I believe, the last non-Mercedes driver to win here back at Ferrari back in 2018. And I've got a list here that I'm going to read through of all the issues that Seb had to compile to an otherwise very difficult weekend. So it started in FP1. He stopped in FP1 with an engine issue, rode the scooter back to the pit lane, which of course was the highlight of the weekend for Sebastian Vettel and a lot of fans, I suppose, seeing him do that. No running in FP2 at all because of the issue. He crashed out in FP3. Got a fine, a €5,000 fine for that scooter ride that he took during FP1. Was only able to get in one qualifying lap, which wasn't enough to get him through to Q2, owing to the fact that his teammate had caused a red flag by crashing into Latifi in a crazy, bizarre moment, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then in the Grand Prix, crashed out of the race himself, which brought out the first safety car. I mean, that's pretty much the weekend from hell. Especially when it's meant to be your first weekend back. I mean, in terms of the driver error moments, could we put that one down to Sebastian just developing a little bit of driver rust, if you like, or ring rust because he was out ill? Or is it just compiled in the fact that this Aston Martin is proven to be a bit of a dog of a car, for lack of a better way of putting it?
It could be a bit of driver rust. We know for other drivers who've had COVID that they said they weren't up to 100% around their first race being back. So it could just be a bit of rust. Obviously, the engine issues and that you can't blame Sebastian for. His teammate crashing, you can't blame Sebastian for. The spin, though, did remind me of his Ferrari spins, which is completely Sebastian. Which does raise the question of he was so invigorated last year. Last year. Sorry, I got myself confused a little bit. But are we now seeing that Sebastian actually has lost some of his special touch if he's starting to spin again, which I hope is not the case. But I did enjoy the screw moment. It's probably, it was definitely the highlight.
It's just
weekend, minus the fine.
It's just wholesomeness from Seb, isn't it? I mean, I feel for the marshal. Obviously, he had to have a long walk back to the pit lane, but it was quite an amusing moment from Seb Vettel. I just hope that if this is his last season in Formula One, and I hope it isn't, but there is obviously the realistic possibility that it could be. Yeah, I hope that his final year is not reduced to moments like that. I want to see better moments for him on the track. Maybe not like a podium, like he got two. Technically, he got two of them. Of course, he was only able to keep one last year, but just more great driver moments from Seb. When we're talking about a 4-time world champion, one of the greatest drivers that's ever been in the sport, being reduced to having a highlight of the weekend by driving around on a scooter and just being an otherwise amazing person. It's not fair. It's not fair for him. Hopefully they can do more. Stroll, let's move on to him now.
Oh, do we have to?
The best thing that you can say about Lance Stroll, well, we've got to cover everyone in fairness. And normally I would be the first person to praise Lance Stroll when he's done well. I think the best thing you can say about his weekend is that he finished in P12. All caveats and that aside, it was a very, very action-packed weekend for him, including that incident in qualifying where, for lack of a better way of putting it, he just didn't look like he was using his mirrors. I mean, look, it was a mad situation that him and Latifi had put themselves in, but at the end of the day, it's quite careless from Lance Stroll, and I want to say that this is an isolated incident, but I've seen him be involved in moments like this before. So, I mean, what on earth can you say to that? It's quite amateurish, really, and he's better than that. He's a lot better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not his biggest fan, but he has had moments where he has. Well, maybe he does deserve to be in the sport, like the Monza in the wet, or Istanbul Park in the wet, where he got those good qualifying times. There, obviously,
it was on pole, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, but in Monza in the wet, I can't remember which year that was. He didn't get pole, but he was.
He was up in the top three. Yeah, I think it was front row in the Williams, I believe it was back then. Yeah.
Yeah. So moments like that, he does deserve to be in sport, but it's moments, silly moments like the incident with Latifi, which, at least for me, raises the question again. Obviously, he's not going to go anywhere, being who he drives for. But top 20 drivers in the world supposed to be in Formula One. That's the purpose. One of the purposes of the sport is the elite drivers in the world shouldn't be making silly mistakes, but not looking in your mirrors, or appearing to not look in the mirrors, I should say. But apart from his action-packed qualifying, it was generally a solid drive through the race. Obviously, in my opinion, he pushed Valtteri off, but I'm not a steward, so can't.
Yeah, it seemed like a bit of a desperate lunge, really. A move that, I suppose some people will say, well, he went for the gap that was there, but I think when you get to a position where you're forcing your opponent off, and the way that he sort of came into that corner, it was more Valtteri just made sure that there wasn't an incident between the two. So he certainly was pushing the boundaries on that one. He did get a 5-second penalty for what is effectively the new Verstappen rule in terms of weaving on the straights, and he almost did it again, I think, after he got penalised for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand why he got it. I thought it was a little bit harsh, and I really used that loosely. I'm probably wrong on this one, but I felt that in terms of weaving, I didn't think he did that much for what he actually got penalised for. But when he kept doing it, I thought, okay, fair cop. Perhaps he does. And it's probably perhaps to set a precedent more than anything else. I think we saw a lot of it last year from Max, particularly in, at certain points, not necessarily in Abu Dhabi, but I think it was in Texas. I think he might have done something like that then. I think Lewis also did something a lot earlier. Maybe not that season, but another one where he did something like that. And also in Brazil, actually, Max was doing it too. So I believe it was. So as I said, I think they have to set a precedent in a way that the old Verstappen no moving under braking rule was brought, and then Sebastian Vettel was penalised for it in Mexico back in 2016, I believe it was. So I get it. I think perhaps it just, sends a message to everyone that they're not going to take any prisoners on this one. Anyone caught weaving in a straight line, which is essentially just trying to block, but quite dangerously, they're obviously going to be penalised in that one as well. So a lot for Aston Martin to do. It's been a difficult weekend for them. It's been a difficult season right now, and whilst I don't believe they have the 9th fastest car at every single circuit, it's certainly looking quite bleak for them at the moment until they can do something about that to change their
they're currently
fortunes.
bottom in the constructors.
Yeah, and maybe 9th fastest might be generous. Perhaps Williams might be able to, or are showing us that they've got something there that obviously we're going to see more of. And that kind of leads us into a nice segue with Williams. And first of all, I want to say I'm so happy to see Alex Albon do so well. And I'm going to go on record in saying this. I think this will go down as one of the performances of the season. I really, really do. Certainly my driver of the day. I know I'm a big Ferrari fan, and I'm glad to see Leclerc what he did, and it was the perfect weekend for Charles Leclerc. You couldn't say he could have done any more than he did. But I'm going to give my driver of the day to Alex Albon. Absolutely phenomenal. He started from the back because, of course, he had that 3-place grid drop. Despite qualifying in 16th, he started at the very back of the grid on the harder tyres, went 57 laps. Wasn't tempted to pit under the safety car at all. He just held his position. And when he was out in the latter stages of the race, he was driving really, really well. The pace was still there. I know Ocon had a bit of a problem behind him, which caused Ocon to not be able to get close to him, but his lap times were very, very good indeed. And he kept that going on really old hard tyres. He looked after them really well on a track that was obviously very difficult if you didn't manage the tyres well. And then he obviously went into the pits on the final lap, pulled on a set of soft tyres and got up to P10. And if it wasn't for a slow pit stop by the team, there's every chance he could have got Gasly and got P9 as well. So it was an absolutely phenomenal drive from Alex Albon. As I said, drive of the day. And I think he's going to go some way to find a better drive this season than what Albon did at the Australian Grand Prix.
Yeah, it was such a solid drive. I was wondering if he was actually going to stop. To be honest, it's like the laps are ticking down. It's like surely you want to leave it not to the very last lap because you want to have some time to get your tires up and use that fresh rubber. But yeah, they obviously left it to the penultimate lap and went for it. But what a drive from Alex.
Yeah,
I think they've found a perfect replacement for George and Williams with Alex.
Well, that's it, really. It just goes to show what talent Alex does have, and hopefully he can produce, perhaps not necessarily performances to that level, because of course it was just a one-off race, but at the same time, it just shows how quick he can be and the job that he can do when he's in the groove. So, great stuff to see from Alex. I think a few people were asking, could he have made that pit stop on the very, very final lap and crossed the line in the same way that Michael Schumacher did at the 1998 British Grand Prix, with all that kerfuffle going on? The short answer is no, he couldn't, because he would have been disqualified before that, because you have to complete at least one racing lap in dry conditions on 2 sets of compounds. So of course, if he crossed the line to start the final lap and he hadn't pitted, he'd have been disqualified right then and there. For the benefit of those of you that aren't sure about that one. Nicholas Latifi, P16. Only thing I can say about his weekend is that he finished the race. He had that incident with Lance Stroll in qualifying, although he did play a part in that, but it was ultimately Stroll's fault. And there wasn't really too much to say about him in the race. Finished P16, he was a lap down. Wasn't last of all the runners. That was Fernando Alonso, and he finished the race. And I know that's not really saying much because he's a professional racing driver. He's a good driver, in my opinion. But right now, he just needs to make sure that he's keeping it out the barriers and finishing Grand Prix right now.
Yeah, I mean, the race, right, the results weren't brilliant. And if it wasn't for the DNFs, he would have been on the back. Well, he would have been 19th if it wasn't for the DNFs. But the race result was solid for what he did. But when you're that far behind your teammate, who started last, it does raise questions. And at the moment, at least for me, now we've got Mazepin gone from the sport. has Nicholas stepped up as the one that likes to crash a lot. He seems to be going for it this year. So hopefully that's not the case. And he just brings up his performance and the level and have a nice good fight with Alex within the team.
Well, I think that's what Williams will be hoping for. You know, we make jokes about him not finishing and crashing, and at the moment it seems to be he's got competition from the Aston Martin guys at the moment on that front. But Williams obviously want to see him challenging Alex in the same way that they would have wanted to have seen him challenge George, and maybe that was a step too far. Maybe this will prove to be a step too far for him as well. But in order for him to have any chance of staying within the team, whose future it could potentially be up in the air depending on what they can do, I feel like there could be more performance in this car and that Williams are starting to unlock it. I mean, the boring answer as to why they're so slow is just they just have less downforce than everybody else. But right now, they just need their guys to be doing the absolute maximum that they can. That's all that they can ask for on that one.
Agreed.
But that's pretty much all we've got time for, guys. Let us know your thoughts on the race. You know, what you liked about it, what certain elements you didn't like, who you thought did a great job and who you thought didn't. There's now another bit of an interlude as we enjoy this Easter weekend, and those of you, of course, celebrating, I hope you have a good one, until we go back to Imola in 2 weeks' time. Right now, it seems the early stages of the story before we start the European phase of the season is that Ferrari, and in particular, Charles Leclerc, looking almost formidable right now. Can anyone catch up and challenge him for it? We'll have to wait and see. If you enjoy this episode of the podcast, make sure you leave us a like if you're watching on YouTube and consider subscribing to the channel. Really helps us out a lot. And if you are listening to us on your favorite podcasting platform, you can also give us a like and follow us on there. Please, if you think we are worthy of a 5-star rating for this episode, please do consider giving us one. We will reward you by reading out the best reviews and the 5-star reviews on the next podcast episode. But until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. Please stay safe, and we'll see you on the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
Goodbye.